Welcome to today's webinar, 2025 Trends in Clinical Trials, focusing on improving trial coverage and complex trial designs, presented by .Malix nQuery. Today's webinar will hopefully provide you a free view of the developments we expect in 2025 in terms of clinical trial design innovations and some of the major regulatory milestones we're expecting to occur this year in 2025. In terms of frequently asked questions, is this webinar being recorded? Yes, the recording and the slides will be sent to you after the webinar is complete via email. If you have any questions or technical issues, please put them into the questions option in your webinar window. If time allows, I'll answer some questions live at the end. Otherwise, I'll answer all the questions provided via email after the webinar is complete, either later today or tomorrow. An email address is also provided in the slide deck, so if you're interested in getting in touch afterwards, please feel free to do so, or go to our website, www.statsols.com. So today's webinar, 2025 Trends in Clinical Trials, is focused in providing you a preview of what to expect based on recent years in terms of clinical trial design innovations in areas such as adaptive design, Bayesian clinical trials, rare disease trials, and then provide you a preview of what we expect to occur in the regulatory area from agencies such as the FDA, EMA, ICH, which provide you a good context for how these might develop going forward. So my name is Ronan Fitzpatrick. I'm the head of statistics and research here at nQuery. I've been with the company over a decade now. Some really big changes have occurred during that time, both for us here at nQuery, but also in the regulatory landscape in terms of the openness of sponsors to innovative approaches like adaptive design, and really excited to talk about how those will continue to develop in the upcoming year. So in terms of our agenda today, we're going to talk about adaptive design, an area which has had major developments over the last 5 years, which I think has a major milestone upcoming in 2025. Bayesian confirmatory trials, obviously Bayesian statistics, a huge area, lots of interest at a theoretical level, but the usage in clinical trials, and particularly at the phase 3 stage, I think is going to see some pretty big changes upcoming based on the FDA's upcoming guidance agenda. And then we'll talk about improving trial coverage, which is a bunch of kind of smaller trends where rare diseases and paediatrics have been a major focus in recent years and how that might continue to develop. Also things such as improving the representativeness or diversity of trials, and things like multi-regional clinical trials, which have some interesting interactions with those upper two areas, but also in terms of the regulatory trends there at the moment. And as I said, conclusion discussion at the end based on questions that have been provided throughout. nQuery, which is the sponsor of this webinar, is your complete solution for optimizing your clinical trial designs. So this does sample size calculations, power calculations, adaptive design, simulation for preclinical research all the way up to confirmatory trials. You can see here a preview of the many different designs and areas which nQuery covers at present. nQuery is a tiered product, so if you buy the top tier expert, you get the pro, plus, and base tiers, whereas if you buy base, you just get base. And basically each of these tiers focuses on a specific domain of interest in clinical trial design, with base focusing on the power and sample size calculations, which have been a core part of the nQuery product for over 25 years now, going all the way back to nQuery Advisor from Dr. Janet Ellis-Schoff, and that now covers hundreds of different scenarios in terms of endpoints, designs, hypotheses, etc. Plus is for our Bayesian sample size features for things like assurance calculations, for sample size for credible intervals, for Bayes factors, and such forth. Pro is for our adaptive design features for areas such as group clinical design, multi-arm, multi-stage designs, phase 2 designs, like Simon's design. And Expert is our simulation tier focused on milestone prediction and other areas. If you're interested in knowing more about any of these tiers or about the product in general, there's a URL provided here to statsols.com, which will provide you more context on these different tiers. So before we go into the specific areas mentioned in the agenda, let's provide a quick overview of where we are in 2025 in terms of the clinical trial landscape. So I think one thing that we've definitely seen over the last decade and accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic is that clinical trials have been increasingly open to innovative approaches in reaction to the main challenges that we've seen, both in terms of getting the right therapeutics to the right patients, but also to the escalating costs of drug development in the clinical trial process over the last 20, 30 years or so. And some of that's pushed from the regulators themselves. Some of that's coming from the legislative branches of various countries. So, for example, in the Cures Act about 15 years ago, in the US was a major milestone in kind of making me more open to Bayesian approaches and adaptive approaches. But I think the main thing is that everyone now recognizes that the clinical trial process needs to be more efficient and more effective to ensure that patients are getting these therapeutics at the right time, but also to kind of reduce the cost and ensure that more potential solutions, more potential therapeutics are actually getting to the development phase, to the clinical trial phase, and so have potential to actually help patients. Today's focus will obviously be on clinical trials because that's where nQuery is focused, but we're part of the Dynamics family, which is a wide variety of different software and solutions for drug discovery. And in particular, in recent year or so, we focused on Luma, which is our AI-enabled drug discovery platform, which is a multimodal approach, which has a lot of really interesting work there if you're involved in the earlier preclinical work in drug discovery. So we've provided the URLs here for both of those, and they're in the references at the end of the slide deck if you want to know more about that. So in terms of clinical trials specifically, I think there's a couple of trends. Obviously, the increase in cost of clinical trials is one thing, but also there's been an increasing recognition that certain parts of the population were not being fairly treated or being fully included in the clinical trial process for a variety of different historical and other reasons. So certain ethnic groups tended to be underrepresented. Certain groups like paediatrics tended to not have the follow-on trials required for approval in those populations. Rare diseases has been a major focus for over a decade now. And the idea here is that clinical trials should do a better job both for standard therapeutics in terms of being more representative, including minorities, having diversity at the heart of their planning stage, but also ensuring that trials which are for specific populations of pediatrics are more effective, and there's a stronger regulatory push to ensure that those trials occur and that those populations end up getting access to these effective treatments. And so what we've seen in response to that, to kind of balance all of these different issues and these different trends, is the regulatory environment has become much more open in the last decade plus. And that means that trial innovations such as Bayesian approaches, adaptive design approaches, which we'll talk about later on, have been developed and also implemented at a much faster rate than you would have seen 10, 20 years ago. As I mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic had a huge effect on that as well. So COVID-19, we saw, group sequential type designs, including a Bayesian sequential design for the approval of the COVID-19 vaccines. The Pfizer obviously was the one that used the Bayesian sequential trial. And we also saw things like platform trials, which were very useful for finding certain therapeutics were effective for COVID-19, such as dexamethasone, and certain other therapeutics, which had a lot of hype, ended up not being effective based on the evidence from those. So those were kind of things which I think now are well past the emergency stage, and those kind of lessons have been integrated or are being integrated into the guidance in various areas. We're seeing a huge acceleration in terms of what we're seeing in terms of clinical trial design, in terms of innovative approaches. And so what I want to focus on today is kind of two innovative approaches, adaptive design and Bayesian analysis, and where we are in terms of those in the clinical trial process, and then talk about this coverage topic, things like pediatrics, increasing diversity in the final part. So adaptive design. I suppose just to ensure we're all on the same page, let's provide a brief overview of adaptive design. So adaptive design is any trial where a change or decision is made to a trial while the trial is still ongoing, and this is basically done on what we call an interim analysis. Now, in any clinical trial, there's a chance of an ad hoc change occurring. The recruitment is slower than expected, or something in terms of safety occurs, and we have to make a change to the trial based on, say, the recommendations of the data monitoring committee. But those are non-planned, so that's kind of slightly different from adaptive design. And adaptive design is more formally where you're pre-planning, you're pre-specifying what these adaptations will be, what these decisions you're going to make at the interim analysis is going to be, and that's what we call this kind of adaptive design area. And so the most obvious thing you could do in adaptive design is to choose to stop the trial early. So there's very strong evidence for your therapeutic or against your therapeutic, and this would be done in what we call a sequential design, or often called a group sequential design. And these would allow you to stop a trial early if there's very little chance your drug will succeed, a very good chance it will succeed, and that means that therapeutic gets out to patients much faster. As I referenced, the COVID-19 vaccine trials, and vaccines is an area where adaptive design and group design is relatively uncommon up to now. We're all one or different types of sequential design, and the ones that succeeded all stopped significantly earlier than they could have planned based on the initially planned vaccine efficacy of 0.6 compared to obviously the 90% plus we saw in many of those trials. But if we're talking about like adaptations, things we can change the trial, not just make a decision to stop the trial, but actually change the trial. We're talking about things like sample size re-estimation, which is increasing the sample size based on basically a misspecification of the sample size calculation. For example, we underestimated the variance, or we thought the effect size estimate was too optimistic compared to what actually happened. And those are kind of different ways you can maybe want to increase the sample size to reflect what you should have known, or you could have known if you've known the truth at the beginning. And then there's things like adaptive randomization. So, you may want to put more of the randomization into the into the cohort that's having the best response. You may want to ensure that certain covariates are more representative, if you have some imbalance in terms of age or gender or something else, or enrichment, where maybe there's certain subgroups who are benefiting disproportionately from your therapeutic based on interim analysis, and you want to basically put more of the drug, more of that group, that subgroup, into your trial and enrich it, as it's called. And so all of these, I kind of think in terms of like the idea of a platonic ideal, right? If you knew what your drug did exactly, you could design a trial perfectly optimized to balance all the different factors, have the correct probability of success while controlling type 1 error, such that you could minimize your overall cost. The adaptive design is basically designed to kind of get you from where you might start with a fixed term trial, where you just do the trial and then do the analysis at the end, move you closer, hopefully, to what that platonic ideal of what the trial would have been based on your pre-trial, moving from your pre-trial assumptions to your assumptions now based on interim data, which obviously is a much better indicator of what's actually going to happen in your trial than what you thought was going to happen before the trial occurred. And so with adaptive design, the idea is hopefully we make more effective and efficient trials. We'll have a better chance of succeeding, of having the trial get to a successful stage, because and not fail due to some misspecification or bad assumption we made at the design stage, but also more efficient, because if we stop the trial early, then that means that the patients get the drug faster, but also the economic cost of the trial will be lower on average. But I think the big thing to note is that if you look at the FDA 2019 guidance, we'll talk about it in the next slide, certain principles should be central to how you choose to do adaptive designs, and basically do careful planning. So things like pre-specification. So it's very much a no-no to have a situation where you're making changes while the trial's ongoing without having told the regulator what those changes are going to be a priori. The simulation is just basically a vital tool now for verifying the operating characteristics of your design over a wide variety of scenarios. Verifying your type 1 error, and your power, but also for a variety of interim and other types of scenarios. And so the careful planning is essential part, because what you're trying to do here is to assess the trade-offs, right? Like a group sequential design nearly always will be more efficient, at least if you're using kind of standard approaches like O'Brien Fleming or Pocock, those type of like boundaries. Will almost certainly be more effective on average for both the null and the alternative hypothesis than a fixed term trial. The option to stop early, outside of the logistical costs and obviously maybe the greater resources constraints on the DMC, overall will definitely reduce your sample size almost certainly compared to a fixed term trial for the vast majority of scenarios. But there's also obviously the logistical challenges. Said you have a more central role for the data monitoring committee in adaptive design. In particular, there's some, the DMC guidance from the FDA recently suggests that perhaps there should be a separate basically group who does the adaptive design decision making, separate from the kind of standard DMC, which focuses on safety signals, and perhaps perhaps could also be focused in, but maybe jointly focus in on the interim decision to stop or not. But it could add a lot of, and obviously the trial integrity is more important then. If people are getting a peek at the data, you need to ensure that no one's getting a peek who shouldn't be getting it, and that could affect the trial outcome and obviously bias the trial, both in terms of its statistical operating characteristics, but also just in, maybe tilting things a little bit in favor of your trial in terms of who to recruit and put into each group and so forth. And things you should be focusing in is like error control. That's the regulator is going to want to know that the type 1 error is controlled. They'll probably also want to know what the power of your trial is. Cost, obviously, the more adaptations you do, the more complex the trial is, the more cost there is in terms of specialist expertise, specialist software. The integrity of the trial, as mentioned, you want to ensure that if you're doing a non-comparative or unblinded trial, that you're not allowing people to see the interim data when they're not supposed to. And sometimes, certain adaptations could lead to a reverse calculation of the interim effect size if you're not careful. And of course, I think, the main thing you're going to do is like, what is the expected benefit? Like, is this trial going to reduce the sample size on average, which is kind of related to cost? Is it going to actually improve things compared to an equivalent, like simpler adaptive design, like group design, or compared to a fixed term trial? And I think, what we're seeing is a growing interest in applying adaptive design in a wider and wider variety of domains. So like one area which I think of particular interest is these publicly funded trials, like building on the success of, say, the recovery trial for COVID-19 therapeutics, which found the dexamethasone was effective and obviously standard part of treatment now. And I think there's much wider interest in doing adaptive design in way more of these kind of publicly funded trials, which obviously could, find, existing drugs which are off patent and kind of get new indications for them, or which could just be more involved in kind of public health indications that are of more interest, which are maybe less of an economic incentive to be involved in. So I think sponsors in terms of the commercial space have been open to adaptive design for a while now, especially after 2019 with the FDA guidance. But I think, this is now spreading to a much wider variety of stakeholders as well. But I think, those ideas of pre-specification, simulation, those lessons need to be brought across if we're going to see adaptive design have the benefit that it's supposed to have, and not just lead to people, doing poorly designed trials that end up, either being invariant in terms of, the probability of success, or reducing the costs, or actually increase the costs because all of the additional logistical challenges, or, increasing the chance of a bias due to reducing trial integrity. The good news is that resources for adaptive design are improving at a rapid pace. Panda, which is provided here on the right in terms of the URL, is a really great resource, very openly available from Sheffield, and covers a wide variety of different adaptive designs, many of the different principles. You can see here kind of a 4-step plan on how you should be thinking about designing your adaptive design. Really great resource. And I think you've also seen other resources like eCrade ran an adaptive design course this year, which I think you probably are still able to sign up to, I hope, even though it's fully complete now, which has had some really useful insights. EU Pearl, which is mostly focused on platform trials, had a lot of great resources. Consort ACE, which was a statement from a few years ago, focused on kind of a checklist of what you should be looking at if you're planning to do an adaptive design. And then there's like online calculators like trialdesign.org, which covers specifically mostly phase 1, phase 2 adaptive designs, which can be very useful. And there's many other things available in like open source software such as OR on CRAN that might be of interest. And so adaptive design, I think, is now a key tool, a key option for designing clinical trials when you're looking to optimize all these different criteria. It's not just your chance of success, but also reducing your overall cost, reducing your sample size burden, and hopefully making certain trials that wouldn't occur otherwise actually occur. And then we have the chance to hopefully get therapeutics into patients' hands that they wouldn't otherwise have got without these innovations like adaptive design. So what are the trends we've seen in adaptive design in recent years, and how do we expect them to build into 2025? Well, I think I'm going to break it down by clinical trial phase, even though one of the macro points I'm going to make is that the area, the lines between the phases is kind of blurring in recent years. But we'll focus first on phase 1. So phase 1 designs, obviously these are your first in human trials. You're trying to find the toxicity, the safety profile of the drug. But I think there's been an increasing interest via the FDA Project Optimus in oncology in particular, in not just finding the toxicity profile, but also finding the efficacy profile, or at least the biological response profile, finding this OBD, optimal biological dose, which obviously isn't a direct likely outcome in terms of overall survival or something like that, but some signal that indicates like here's what the drug has its most effective output, say based on PK, PD type outcomes. And I think, in oncology in particular, and this is actually, basically the norm in other areas, like outside of oncology, where, looking for the OBD is a standard part of the process. But, in oncology, obviously, the last 10, 20 years, we've seen this huge uptick in immunotherapies, which basically have a very different profile from the traditional cytotoxic chemotherapy, radiotherapy type treatments, which had a very simple profile, like, the more you increase a cytotoxic agent, the higher the efficacy tended to be. So there's very much a focus, find the maximum tolerable dose, the maximum tolerated dose in terms of toxicity, in terms of these DLTs, and basically just focus on that. Don't worry about OBD because it's a monotonic relationship in terms of efficacy in terms of increasing the dose. But with these immunotherapies, we're seeing much more complex profile. We're seeing things like delayed effects in terms of like the later stage trials. But in early stage trials, I think that idea that more of the immunotherapy increases the responses is just not coming true. And so finding a balance between ensuring we have a good profile of the safety in terms of the dose, but also in terms of what might actually be the most effective, has become increasingly important. And you're seeing also, it's mostly in the second part here in phase 2, also greater interest in kind of bridging the gap between phase 1 and phase 2 into these cohort expansion trials, where you find a couple of doses which are most important or which have the most promising profile. You expand those particular doses, and then that kind of bridges almost in a seamless way from the kind of later stages of phase 1, phase 1B into the phase 2A stage. So Project Optimus is a great resource if you want to know more about the FDA's view on this. They also had this guidance here recently, which also covers this topic. And just to note, all the guidances I reference here and all the projects, etc., I mentioned here are in the references at the end of the slide deck. So if you're interested in knowing more or you want to find out more, the links are all provided in the slide deck. So in terms of phase 2, I suppose the important thing to note here is that like adaptive design is already very common in phase 2. Simon's designs, Fleming designs, these are all designs where you had the option to stop the trial out of your fertility if the drug was particularly unpromising. And that's a reflection of the fact that phase 2 was the most common stage of the clinical trial process in which a drug was likely to fail. This is the first time we're looking for a signal, not only that the drug is safe, which was the primary focus of phase 1, but it actually works based on some more robust endpoint, perhaps not the gold standard endpoint, but perhaps a surrogate like an overall response rate or progression-free survival in oncology. But I think, if I think about trends in phase 2, I'd be thinking in terms of the kind of blurring of the lines between phase 2 and phase 1, between phase 2 and phase 3, and even within phase 2 itself. And so, as I mentioned already, the cohort expansion idea, I think that's already kind of like it seems to be gelling together. That's a central part of the Project Optimus plan for how phase 1 and phase 2 will link together in a more direct way. In terms of like making the phase 2 process more unified, NC-BOD first developed, around 10, 15 years ago. I think, it's well validated, has good operating characteristics, and that makes the kind of proof of concept and dose finding aspects more combined into a single statistical operation, kind of adds some additional efficiency there. And I expect similar trends there. And there's Bayesian NC-BOD and similar innovations that kind of build on an initial model. And then there's kind of these seamless phase 2, phase 3 models, which we've seen many successes. For example, Terzabay Mounjaro from Eli Lilly was based on a seamless phase 2, phase 3 trial, for example. And these are kind of MAMS, pick the winner type trial selection designs, where effectively, we have, like, say, 5 doses in the phase 2B trial, in the dose finding trial, and then we're going to pick the best performing dose or the 2 best performing doses, and they're going to be brought forward into the phase 3 trial, and the data from the phase 2 stage is going to be included in the overall analysis, or at least be integrated in the final analysis, maybe via borrowing, if not directly included in the final analysis. And so these kind of seamless designs, I think, the kind of blurring of the lines between the phase 2 and its brothers on the other 2 sides, I expect that to continue and to be a continuing focus of interest in the upcoming year. In terms of phase 3 trials, I think, increasingly group clinical designs and variants thereof, like promising zone designs, I think they're becoming more standard. They're not everywhere yet. I think a lot, sometimes the fixed term trial is just the standard choice, but I think that metric is inching up year on year if you look at the statistics from the DIA and such. And I think what we're seeing now in the companies which are in more innovative end, who are moving towards the end, is like much more interested in integrating more complex methods, more complex elements such as Bayesian statistics borrowing and such. And of course, that kind of reflects the growing comfortableness of the regulator, particularly the FDA, with simulation-based approaches. And I think what we're seeing here in 2025 is one major milestone, which is the draft ICH E20 draft on adaptive clinical trials. So, the ICH, it's an entity which exists to kind of regularize the regulatory approach across the EMA, FDA, and other regulators, and provide a centralized resource where this is kind of what everyone agrees on, or well, let's say most people agree on, should be the high-level principles for doing something such as adaptive design with ICH 20. For example, the estimate framework, ICH E9 or 1, was a really important milestone for the estimate framework getting a lot more acceptance in the clinical trial and other clinical development spaces. So it'd be really interesting to see what's in this, but it's just a major milestone in and of itself, another move towards adaptive design becoming almost a standard option in the clinical trial toolbox for those sponsors who are interested in doing so. So for me, the big questions when we think about what will be in this guidance is, I would expect it to have a decent amount of alignment with the FDA 2019 guidance. I think that's the best in class guidance on adaptive design among all of the options out there. And I think its focus on kind of high level principles, which didn't exclude adaptive designs, which was very open, but which set kind of boundaries, which meant that in confirmatory space, this is mostly focused on phase 3, this guidance most likely, that you had a good idea of the rules that you're going in with, and therefore that created a good space for a positive relationship between the sponsor and the regulator to come together and build something which will hopefully achieve something which they all want, which is reducing the cost of the trial, getting the trial finished faster if the drug is very promising or very unpromising, and ultimately hopefully benefiting patients in terms of reduced costs and faster access to therapeutics. And so the FDA guidance has several principles that it goes through. I think the ones I focus on here are like things like pre-specification, simulation, trial integrity. One that I think it'll be interesting to see what's included, because obviously this is coming from the ICH, which isn't a regulator in and of itself, rather than the FDA guidance, which is obviously talking about what the FDA is doing, albeit obviously the legal enforceability of that is a whole other thing, not the focus today. Is the early engagement. I think early engagement, a major focus of the FDA and its guidance and interest in recent years in terms of doing complex trials in general. And, I think it'll be interesting to see whether the ICH guidance chooses to. I would say decent chance at least gets referred to. How much of an emphasis it is, we'll see. But I think these ideas of pre-specification, that the interim analysis should be pre-specified. So you should be pre-specifying when the interim analysis occur. You should be pre-specifying the conditions in which the adaptation will occur. All these ideas, I think, will be very central. I imagine I'd be very surprised if pre-specification isn't a central thing. I think simulation will be in there. I think, there's some different kind of normative differences between different regulators on how much they like simulation. The FDA is much more open to it these days compared to maybe historically the EMA would be less open to it. But I think, the success of simulation and how much it's been so widely used these days means that those kind of barriers, I think, internationally are breaking down. I think simulation will be in there, and I think using it would basically consider to be essential for verifying your type 1 error at the very least, and probably your power and other operating characteristics. And trial integrity, I think this will be a huge emphasis in terms of ensuring that if you're doing a comparative adaptive design, basically an unblinded one, where you're actually looking at the study labels, that ensuring the trial integrity is maintained both at the logistical level, but also just at the kind of technical statistical level. Because in certain calculations, say for promising zone, in theory, one could reverse engineer the interim effect size from the adaptation that occurs in terms of its magnitude. And so I expect that will probably be mentioned. I think it will be interesting to see how much they dig down into specific adaptive designs rather than just focusing on these high-level principles. The FDA guidance went through a number of different types of adaptive designs, and that was really useful and kind of, I think, built on the idea like the earlier guidance from almost 10 years before 2019, which was quite heavily criticized at the time for having what they called well understood and not well understood, these kind of two dichotomy of what were good adaptive designs and bad. Well, that's unfair phrasing, but in effect, from the sponsor point of view, if it's not well understood, you're much less likely to do it. But it does break down in 2019. Okay, here's sample size re-estimation, here's response adaptive randomization, etc. And I think it'll be interesting to see how much the ICH guidance digs down into that level. I think it will provide something like that to a certain extent, but I would wonder if it'll be as in depth as the FDA guidance was, which also included sections that say Bayesian adaptive designs as well. So I would say the main emphasis will be on these kind of high level principles, and then you'll get some information on kind of specific types of adaptive design, and probably a big, I think there will still be that big focus on, a difference between a non-comparative or blinded adaptive design and unblinded, which are much more favorable profile for the former, because blinded will kind of, why not do a blinded adaptive design might be not quite to that level of strength, but certainly that, a very strong endorsement of it if done properly, of course, in terms of avoiding breaking the blind. But I think that it should be really interesting to see what occurs there, and things like open label trials that kind of offer their own challenges as well. I think the FDA guidance provided stuff like Bayesian adaptive designs, as I mentioned earlier. We'll be interested to see how much this guidance chooses to overlap with some of these more complex additions to adaptive designs. I think there'll be generally an idea of making a decision or like criterion based on a Bayesian criteria will probably be fine, but whether you want to have a fully Bayesian adaptive design, whether that be included or talked about here, it'll be interesting to see. I think one of the working groups did focus on that, so I'd probably be on the positive side that this will be a pretty big part of the ICH guidance, and it'll be interesting to see how much they fall in on the fully Bayesian versus the Bayesian as a complement, in terms of like borrowing, historical borrowing using say a power prior, which would be a major focus of the next section, or just like the kind of fully Bayesian kind of approach where the actual final decision at the final analysis is based on like a posterior error or such. Just a note that in the last couple of years we've seen the CID program, the Complex Innovative Design program from the FDA, which has had lots of really great resources. There was a workshop which the slides and the recording are available at the URL provided here. This was a workshop in March, the year just gone past. So if you're interested in knowing more about these kind of adaptive designs, which are complex, which means they have multiple adaptations, they include things like Bayesian statistics or master protocols or other, advanced elements, that's something I would definitely recommend. And that's a program which I think is probably going to get wrapped up and become more standardized as part of the process of running these types of trials in the FDA going forward. But certainly, lots of useful lessons there if you're interested in knowing more about it. Not just doing kind of standard adaptive designs like groups potential or promising zone, but going into these more complex areas. Certainly, lots of resources there worth investigating. In terms of other broad trends, as I mentioned, there's kind of a lot of interest in extending these adaptive designs outside of oncology, into things like, and based on the kind of lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think platform trials can continue to grow, but also just the wider usage of adaptive designs and publicly funded trials, as I mentioned, I expect to be quite a significant trend that continues to grow. And within the commercial space, non-oncology drugs or therapeutics continuing to use adaptive design more commonly. In terms of nQuery, we spent a lot of time over the last 4 or 5 years adding to our adaptive design portfolio. The last couple of years have focused on group design and overhauling that from the ground up, but adding in a whole bunch of extra improvements in terms of the group sequential methods available, but also just the UI and the user experience of doing group design and nQuery. So what I have here is just a very simple group example, which may be of interest, but I'm not going to cover this in too much depth. If you're interested in knowing more about this, we covered this in our webinar series last year, so you can go to that if you want to see this example in full. But in this example, we have basically 0.05 significance level, a one-sided test, a two-sided test, and you can see here that nQuery, each row basically corresponds to an input. Each column is an individual calculation, where white rows are input rows and yellow rows are the ones that we can calculate for, what we'd call solver rows internally. And you can see here on the right that as you select each row, you'll get a help card which provides you context for this. And you can go to the user manual as well. It has a full chapter on group sequential design if you're interested in knowing more about this area. So in this case, we have a 2-look design, so 1 interim analysis and 1 final analysis. So this number includes the final analysis in the total number of looks. We have a group 1 mean of -1.5, a group 2 mean of -2.3. These were changed from baseline values. The validity of using change from baseline rather than doing, say, an ANCOVA analysis, we'll leave aside. A lot to get through today. 2.1 standard deviation per group. We had an O'Brien-Fleming spending function, which is specified down here. And you can see that this UI, if you're not familiar with the newer GST options in nQuery, is much more dynamic. So for example, if we picked, say, the Wang-Tsiatis gamma spending function, you can see a new field automatically opens up, which reflects that. And if we were to, say, change the efficacy band calculation method from spending function to, say, Wang-Tsiatis, then we'd have a completely different set of inputs. But we'll focus on the kind of O'Brien-Fleming spending function, which was the option that he used here. And if you wanted to change, say, the interim analysis to occur 25% of the way through instead of halfway through, we could just change this to 0.25 instead. So in this case, we put in our sample size ratio of 1, we put in our power of 80%, and we should get 109 per group, which is basically the 121 multiplied by the dropout rate of 15%. And you can see here that in this side table, as we call them, you have the GST output. You can see here that effectively at the interim analysis halfway through after 109 subjects had follow-up, if the Z statistic was between basically -2.9 and 2.9, we would continue to the next look. Otherwise, if we were above 2.9 or below -0.29, obviously 2-sided test where we're technically saying efficacy is true in both directions, then we would stop early for efficacy. But if we were to make a slight change to this, may say move this to 0.65 the one-sided level, add in a futility boundary, and let's say that's a Wang-Tsiatis, so not quite as conservative for futility. We could generally be a bit more aggressive. We'll say there's -1.5, which is a bit closer to the Pocock boundary, which is a kind of a more aggressive boundary. Then we'll get something like this. And you see that the sample sizes increase a little bit from 109 per group to 116 per group. If we reset power, actually it's 114 per group. So, an increase of around 10 people in the study, but now we have the option based on this to stop early. And now at this first look, if the Z statistic was greater than 2.963, we'd stop early for efficacy. If it was less than 0.508, we'd stop early for futility. And at the final analysis, if it's above 1.969, which is quite close to what we'd have for a fixed term trial of 1.96, then we'd stop early for efficacy. But if it's below that, we'd stop early for futility. But if you wanted to see that, say, on the p-value scale, we could select that from the boundary scale option here. And you can see here that at the first look, if the p-value was less than 0.002 approximately, we'd stop early for efficacy. And if it was greater than 0.306, we'd stop early for futility, or at least we have the option to, since this is a non-binding futility boundary. So that's obviously not the focus of today's webinar. You can see more about the group central report, which provides a detailed breakdown of the interim analysis and the probability of stopping at each look. There's a boundary plot if you're interested in exporting something to more visually display your results. But for today, we're focusing obviously on the wider trends. But just want to provide a preview of what we're looking at nQuery. So for example, in nQuery, if you're interested in sample size re-estimation, there's options for that. There's also options for your group central design for other endpoints like proportions and survival. There's also blinded sample size re-estimation using the internal pilot approach, multi-arm, multi-stage designs, and phase 2 designs like the Simons designs and variants thereof, such as Lin and Shi, and Bryant and Day. So let's move on to Bayesian confirmatory trials. So I suppose before we get into Bayesian confirmatory trials, let's just give a very brief overview of what Bayesian clinical trials could mean overall. So Bayesian analysis, I'm almost certainly going to get in trouble with any definition that I give, but at a high level, Bayesian analysis is a method where the statistical methodology where the prior, basically a pre-specified prior, an idea of what you think the distribution of the parameter is, like say the mean difference is updated via data. So you get actual data, you do an actual trial, and then that is updated via what we call the likelihood to give a posterior distribution for the test statistics. So effectively we have a prior, what we believe beforehand, we have data, we combine those to get a posterior, which is the new distribution, our new estimate for what the actual test statistic is. And why would we want to do this? Well, there's flexibility, there's intuitive reasons given, the ability to integrate prior. So the idea here is that like in a Bayesian framework, it's much easier to do things like say sequential analysis, basically due to the way that the test statistic will converge towards the true test statistic in a Bayesian paradigm. Basically the problem of like repeated measurements, that basically for the reason why we have to do kind of fairly complex approaches for group central design in the frequentist framework. Bayesians would argue that that's basically not a problem in the Bayesian feature. Now, some of the other things like trial integrity certainly still are, but in terms of the statistical operating characteristics, that issue kind of mostly goes away. Bayesians would argue it has a more intuitive interpretation. So, in the frequentist framework, that's based on kind of long run probabilities, and it's based on this idea that you have a null hypothesis. This is like, the null hypothesis that the drug doesn't work, that the mean difference is 0. And then based on that, you're basically going, well, assume that's true. How likely is it that the actual, data that you generated would have occurred? Whereas in the Bayesian framework, they would argue, you're much more interested in the opposite. Like, how likely is the hypothesis to be true given the data I have? So that they would argue that it's more intuitive, and there is research out there talking to medical staff and such that backs it up to some extent, and some of the references to go through that kind of field work are provided in the references at the end. And this idea of being able to integrate priors, so in the frequentist framework you don't really have a prior, you just have your null hypothesis that's just fixed, and you kind of you basically are comparing everything to that null hypothesis. But in the prior, you have much more flexibility to integrate existing data, so data from previous trials, data from expertise, and such and so forth. And you have multiple options there to create a prior that reflects the current understanding, the current knowledge level, current belief level about the success probability or the actual profile of the parameter of interest, such as the mean difference. I think the biggest barrier right now is the requirement for specialized software and expertise. I often think that statistical education is as much about teaching the heuristics as it is about the actual technical detail. Most statistics education that isn't going to biostatisticians and experts in the field, it's going to medical students, it's going to scientists, and they only have so much time in the day. Obviously, a lot of other things you have to focus on. Like, I'm not going to pretend as a statistician that I have a PhD level expertise in pharmacokinetics or pharmacodynamics, but there needs to be a bringing together of understanding. And I think right now Bayesian statistics basically requires like specialized things like JAGS or STAN, which it's a little bit beyond where the standard thing is. I think bridging that gap, making this more accessible will probably be a big thing, though that will have its own danger levels of currently frequentist statistics are often misinterpreted because they're kind of used without a statistician in the group to kind of help guide and have the appropriate clinical trial design ideas like sample size calculations and the appropriate like clinical trial analysis tools such as mixed modeling and such. In terms of like our phases, so I'll kind of use the phases framework here again. At phase one, obviously 3+3, this kind of algorithmic design was kind of the standard approach for many years, but now has been pushed out. You'll still have holdouts who continue to want to use it, but in reality, I think the FDA is very strongly saying, and other regulators are very strongly saying that we should be moving beyond 3+3. And I think the important thing to notice here is that some of the sequels to 3+3, like I3+3 and GI+3, even though they're algorithmic and they're much more sophisticated and have much better operating characteristics, will tend to include Bayesian criteria for, say, excessive toxicity, basically to ensure that you don't go too high in terms of your toxicity, well above where you should be, basically overdose control. And so I think in that case, which we're seeing is that even for the algorithmic ones, the 3+3 progenitors, which kind of are improvements of it there, are including Bayesian things. And you're obviously seeing a much wider variety of ones which are more purely Bayesian. So I'd say the most Bayesian would be things like the continual reassessment method, which is basically just a kind of a fully Bayesian approach. You have Bayesian logistic regression models. So these kind of modeling approaches, I think there's a big push from the statistics community to try to use these more because they have a lot of flexibility and a lot of really great operating characteristics in terms of having full control over your trial. But what I would say is that, in practice, based on what I'm seeing, at conferences, to a lesser extent in literature, is that there's certainly a pushback from the people who run these trials, who obviously aren't statisticians typically, that they would prefer like a rule-based or algorithm-based approach. But those algorithms now tend to have a Bayesian base, like the kind of decision tree or the decision table will tend to be based on some kind of Bayesian characteristics, such as posterior probability. And so things like MTPI2 and such all have some relationship to Bayesian statistics. So I think Bayes is kind of the default at this stage for phase one, I would say, as we move beyond 3+3, either as being the central way the whole thing is designed or as an important complement or to an algorithmic approach like I3+3. So in terms of phase two, I think over many years there's been growing interest in using Bayesian methods in phase two. I think there's several Simons-like designs which have been out there, like Thal and Simon was a very early one. We've got multiple requests over the years from people to include it, and it's definitely on our development agenda for this year and going forward. There's BOP2 or Bayesian optimal designs, which have become of increasing interest in recent years. So definitely interesting kind of replacing, or not replacing, but having a Bayesian complement to those existing Simons-like designs, which are obviously so common. Basket trials, and to a lesser extent umbrella trials, Bayesian would be basically the default for basket trials, given to them much easier. It's much easier to do like borrowing, saying use a power prior or a meta-analytic prior in a basket trial than in the frequentist framework. So I would say for basket trials, which is where you have basically the same drug, but you want to apply to multiple subgroups, say based on some kind of genetic marker, and kind of see which subgroups have the best response. I think in those ones you're going to see, you already see Bayesian as kind of the default. And I think in terms of including things like borrowing and including things like seamless designs, including things like monitoring, like in maybe some types of interim analysis, I think Bayesian statistics has great amount of promise for those. And I think in phase two, you're already seeing like a big push towards Bayesian statistics. I think it's not like phase one where Bayesian is kind of the default, but I think a healthy mix of both frequentist and Bayesian, I would expect that to continue to grow, and it'll reach some kind of equilibrium. But I think Bayesian is definitely on the upswing at the moment. But I think the big area I want to focus on today is that there's increasing interest in expanding this usage of Bayesian approaches to confirmatory phase 3 trials. So I think the important thing to note is that it's still quite uncommon for a phase 3 trial to use a Bayesian success criterion. So to, for example, have the drug approved based on a posterior error rate, like a posterior error, rather than a p-value. Why is this? Well, there's unfamiliarity, right? Like, basically in a phase 3 trial where the stakes are so much higher, talking about thousands of patients, you're talking about like costs of millions, doing something new and different obviously includes the cost of being the one who finds out, oh, actually this doesn't work, or, this problem we didn't see came up. And so there's obviously a natural conservative bias, a kind of Burkean bias to kind of like, if it works, don't touch it, just kind of do it as we are. As I said, the regulatory situation is becoming much more open, much more open to early engagement to kind of talk through these things, to kind of figure these things out beforehand. But right now, the regulatory guidance in the confirmatory area for drugs and biologics is pretty much, not non-existent. There is stuff in terms of complex innovative designs and stuff like that, but it's fairly sparse. It's much better developed in, say, medical devices, but that's the regulatory chain for that's very different. So that kind of represents that the things there, unique aspects of that as well. And then I think the 0.025 type 1 error rate, I think it's going to be a big bugbear for both the regulators, the frequentists, and the Bayesians, but it is something which basically you see in a lot of these proposals for Bayesian clinical trials, is that there's certainly people who come from a more pure Bayesian approach, that the slight annoyance that they have to do this type 1 error verification, usually via simulation, and that's a central part of designing these tools. But I think, despite these barriers, you've seen a notable uptick in Bayesian methods in phase 3, as I say, due to the kind of regulatory push, due to the, as I mentioned, the kind of changes we're expecting in the regulatory space in the near future. But I think we've seen more usage of Bayesian methods, both fully Bayesian and Bayesian methods being a complement to kind of a frequentist analysis at the end. So obviously a notable one is the COVID-19 vaccine trial from Pfizer, which was a Bayesian sequential design, obviously from BioNTech as well. And this was, it had operating characteristics which were very, very similar to a standard group sequential design. So it wasn't exactly going out of the box in terms of its, like here's what the here's what the here's what the boundaries are based on the z-scale and such like that. But it was a fully Bayesian design where the interim analysis and the final analysis decision making was based on the posterior error. So I think it was a really interesting push forward, and obviously an area and a space where innovation and speed were so highly prioritized that there was more openness to doing this in an area like vaccines, which this would be very uncommon. Outside of that, I'm quoting a lot from the CID program here. You have lymphoma, which had an external control or ECA, external control arm. You had borrowing. You have borrowing approaches. You have sample size Goldilocks approaches. You have extrapolation in pediatric populations, so using the kind of Bayesian, the information from the the trial in the adult population to extrapolate out to the pediatric population alongside the actual pediatric data you'll get in your trial. So lots of interesting case studies, but not a broad trend that kind of would make the average sponsor, or for certainly a smaller company, fully comfortable with like implementing Bayesian stuff unless they had a lot of expertise already on staff. But I think a huge milestone, or certainly I think will be a huge milestone, is coming in 2025 from the FDA, where the draft guidance called Bayesian Methodology in Clinical Trials of Drugs and Biologics is coming. This is required under the PDUFA 7 to be done by the end of 2025. Now, small possibility it leaks into early 2026. We'll see. The FDA obviously has a lot of changes probably upcoming due to the wider political environment, but this is in PDUFA. That usually means that they stick to that, and this is really big, because this is kind of similar to 2019 adaptive design guidance in terms of setting the table for like what are the principles that you require, that set out when and how you should do a Bayesian confirmatory trial. And I imagine it will probably include references to the great success of Bayesian statistics in early stage trials. But I think similar to the adaptive guidance, I think there will be a big focus, maybe not the primary focus like adaptive guidance, but certainly a very substantial focus on, okay, how does Bayesian methodology help us improve confirmatory trials, or how can we run a fully Bayesian confirmatory trial? As I said, alignment with the adaptive design guidance I expect to be quite good. Early engagement will be central to it, especially if you're doing a more innovative Bayesian approach. Pre-specification, so I think you can't just pick a prior arbitrarily or within the trial. You have to pre-specify what your prior is going to be, or how that prior will be updated, and things like that. I wouldn't expect it to be prescriptive on specific methods or design choices, like what prior to use. So for example, if you're doing borrowing, I don't expect it to go like you should use a meta-analytic prior or a power prior. I wouldn't expect it to be as prescriptive on like what your success criterion should be. So I think posterior error will probably be maybe referenced as the preferred choice slightly, but something like a predictive probability, a Bayesian predictive probability, maybe referenced there as another option. And I think I think it won't be prescriptive is the main thing. Similar to the adaptive guidance, it'll be mostly about setting up the principles that you should take into mind to do a Bayesian analysis properly. And some of this will be more specific to the Bayesian stuff. Like I think prior choice will inevitably be a focus in there, and I think you'll hear things like about what data sources might be appropriate. Elicitation frameworks, if you're thinking of using expertise, will probably come up to some extent. So I think that'll be really interesting to see. I think it will possibly, I would probably err on the side of probably, include some common use cases. I think borrowing will be one area that will probably get a decent amount of focus. I think interim analysis, like using Bayesian criteria for interim analysis or for go, no-go type decisions, I think that would be much less controversial than for the final analysis. So for example, deciding to stop the trial based on this, but the final analysis still requires a p-value, so you might have to fulfill both those simultaneously. I think those are both quite open to that, but we'll see. It'll be interesting to see. I think, as I say, early phase, I think it'll be mostly open to that, but it might have some thoughts on that. And phase 3, I think this is one of those things that will be a big talking point, and probably one of those things you get a lot of feedback during the, from the feedback phase on the draft guidance. It's a 0.025 type 1 error and statistical power. I think 0.025 will still be retained as a default. I think that's everything I'm hearing suggests that's going to be there. I understand why the regulator has that perspective. From their perspective, having a fixed rate, which is kind of a fixed type 1 error rate based on a paradigm which has worked for them for many, many years, makes a lot of sense. Ultimately, we have to remember that the regulator and the sponsor, certainly for commercial sponsors, aren't necessarily aligned in terms of their incentives. So having you must get below this p-value to get to even talking to the next stage, or to have a good chance of getting the next stage, makes a lot of sense for regulator, just to provide a kind of a minimum baseline, and so that not every meeting with the sponsor becomes a big debate and a big negotiation of what the success criterion should specifically be. So type 1 error verification probably still going to be in, but I think they'll be very open to doing that via simulation, so you won't need to have derived that via formula or analytic solution. I think power will probably still be a criteria that they would like to have. So this is obviously the kind of probably success from the frequentist point of view under some specified alternative, and simulation over a wide variety of other scenarios in terms of sensitivity analysis. I expect that to be an expectation as well. So that'll probably be a big debate. I think I'm not even sure that the Bayesian community necessarily wants to replace p-values, because then you kind of get into the Goodhart's law problem of when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And is there going to be an agreement that like a Bayes factor of X or a posterior probability of 0.0995 or 0.95 or something like that's going to become the default? I think just due to the natural evolution, that kind of idea of having a default success criterion is anathema to many people who would be within the Bayesian community. But I think the regulator needs something like that, so there'll be a bit of tension there. It'll be interesting to see how that develops, both in the initial draft and then obviously in the kind of back and forth in terms of development into a final guidance over the upcoming years. As I mentioned, I think it'll be much more open to showing that where a Bayesian method such as borrowing has clear value, that the regulator will be very open to that. If you could show the value, we're open for business. And I think rare diseases and paediatrics are two areas that you can see from the CID program. Is already, I think they're basically going to be open for business, would be my perspective. Obviously, in these areas, it's hard to get additional patients, or it's hard to get sponsors to actually do the work of doing a pediatric trial, even when sometimes it's a requirement of the initial approval. So I think lowering the barriers to entry to these areas via things like borrowing, external control arms, stuff like that, extrapolation. I think that will be very open to that based on what we're seeing so far. I think, as I said, Bayesian statistics being used for secondary endpoints, for interim, like as a criteria for making an adaptive design change. I think they'll be pretty open to that as well. So, as a complement, as something which kind of adds on to an existing analysis in areas where Bayesian analysis kind of maximizes the existing value of data, the existing data, to ensure that certain underrepresented populations get their fair due and a fair access to these therapeutics. I think you'll have a positive view there. But look, that's to some extent, that's a speculation. This is what I've heard from different stakeholders at different conferences and stuff like that. I've been following it very closely, and I'm very excited to see what we get, hopefully a few months before this time next year. So, just in terms of smaller things like decision theoretic stuff and probably success measures like assurance, I don't think that'll be a major focus. That's mostly a sponsor problem. Like, how likely your trial to succeed is mostly of interest to the sponsor rather than the regulator necessarily. In terms of certainly in terms of the null hypothesis and stuff like that, or sort of like futility and stuff. But assurance calculations, I think we're planning a major overhaul of assurance calculations this year. We're also looking at areas like Bayesian phase 2 designs, but of course, because it's areas under so much rapid change, to a certain extent, we're kind of waiting to see what the emerging norms are to be before we make a full-throated jump into this area. So areas like phase 1 and phase 2, we feel comfortable already doing work in the background to design tools for trial design in those areas. For phase 3 confirmatory trials, a little bit of wait and see, but things like assurance calculations and things like Bayes factors, and we've already added features in there. So we're obviously happy if you have your own views of what we should be working on in the Bayesian area in terms of clinical trial design, in terms of sample size calculations. We'd be happy, very happy to get that feedback. So this is just a very simple assurance calculation. I'm just going to briefly go back to nQuery and kind of go through this here today as well. So in this case, this is kind of the simplest calculation where you have a assurance calculation, which is basically where you have a traditional power calculation, but basically averaged over some prior. And in this case, you have kind of simplest for a two mean case. Imagine a prior over the mean difference. So the mean difference is 0.2 in this case. The variance for the prior was 0.06. So imagine basically a prior with a mean at 0.2 and with a variance of 0.06, or you can take the square root for the standard deviation. And then, this is a prior just for the mean difference. So we're going to assume that the actual, per group standard deviation is actually truly 0.25. And that gives a posterior variance for the difference of such when we get the sample size. We have a sample size of 25, and you can see we get an assurance of 0.595. This is on the proportion scale, so around 60% assurance if you're comparing to the, I believe, 80% power this would have for a frequentist power calculation. And you can see the prior posterior variance, which is basically just your standard error squared. And nQuery has a wide variety of different options for assurance for different types of prior, like a custom prior. For example, here we have, let's assume there's a 20% chance the mean difference is 0.1 instead of 0.2, and 20% chance it's 0.3, but most of the probabilities is actually the initial estimate of 0.2, so 0.6 of the probabilities on 0.2, and you can see the assurance is a bit higher here because we have a more clustered prior compared to the normal prior for the initial example, and this extends to proportions, survival curves, and so on and so forth. We also have options for sample size for credible intervals, for both pure credible intervals, and also mixed intervals where you actually want to fulfill a confidence and credible interval characteristic at the same time. Sample size for Bayes factors, sample size based on region of practical equivalence if you're interested in bioequivalence using a Bayesian paradigm, and also things like this phase one is not a huge emphasis right now, but we do have a tool for CRM calculation for the sample size there based on a very simple approximation. So lots to think about for us here, and your feedback hugely weighted when we're deciding what to work on in future updates. So any feedback you have, very much welcome. So the final section, focusing on improving trial coverage. This is kind of an amalgamation of many kind of different areas. But I think, if we're talking about trials, clinical trials, historically, I would say they haven't necessarily always been great at reaching out to certain populations, to certain subgroups. And, I think improving the ability of clinical trials to reach those has been a really big emphasis of legislators, and then therefore the regulators in the last 5 to 10 years or so. So, if you're talking about difficult conditions or ensuring that everyone who could benefit from a therapeutic is getting access to therapeutic, we're thinking here about rare diseases. We're thinking about things like the pediatric population. So for rare diseases, it's very obvious, right? Rare diseases, I think it's less than 50,000 people have it. These are things where 1 in 50,000, sorry. These are diseases where the economic incentive does not exist for a standard drug approval process or all the money involved in that to go through. So you have in pretty much every developed jurisdiction programs that exist to incentivize that. You have voucher programs and such like that, which are designed to incentivize them. But also, I think in more recent years, there's more focus on ensuring, that the regulatory landscape was adapted and made more flexible to reflect the unique challenges here. Like, obviously the sample size requirements just necessarily need to be lower, and maybe a greater need to take advantage of, you only have so many patients, and you have so many therapeutics. There's only so many, factorials you can put that into, so maybe a better need to borrow across multiple disease programs, multiple therapeutic programs, using things like Bayesian borrowing and such like. So I think this is a big area of focus for the regulators, for sponsors, and obviously most important for patients who have rare diseases. This is something I think I would say we have failed to reach those patients, and I think being more flexible on the regulator side and the sponsor side to kind of bridge that gap, get use the information we have available to the best of our ability, and be more flexible in terms of worrying about 0.65 type 1 error, and be more flexible around that makes a lot of sense. And in the pediatric population, quite similarly, it's quite common for a pediatric indication to be desired by the regulator, but for the sponsor not to be interested due to the attendant costs and obviously the risk. Like, obviously when things go wrong in a pediatric trial, that tends to be, even more so than an adult trial, more of a controversy, more of a problem for obvious reasons, for any kind of experimentation that you're doing on children. And so, the regulatory guidance on this is very tight, but despite that, I think we need to be very thorough in ensuring that the pediatric population is getting the treatments that they should be getting, and obviously trying to prevent the most tragic of outcomes, which is people, children suffering from diseases, dying from diseases unnecessarily. Simultaneously, I think you've seen a more broad regulatory push, particularly in the last couple of years, based on some legislative changes, particularly in the US, to improve the representativeness, improve the diversity of clinical trials. And there's kind of two reasons they're doing this. One is from the kind of, in terms of representativeness as a term, they hope to improve the generalizability of trial conclusions. So, there's been a recent focus, some recent documents on, say, on the pregnant population, that they haven't necessarily had the guidance and the kind of insight that they need, but just in terms of like a broader sense of like the ethnic profile, in terms of the gender profile, like obviously historically, the representation of women in trials has not been where it should have been. That's got better, but it's maybe not where it needs to be in certain cases. So it's certainly early phase. So you want trials to have a reasonably representative section of the population, and that is basically in the hope that the results from those trials will therefore be more applicable to a wider set of the populations, in the case that there happens to be some difference, some variance in the response depending on those factors. And obviously some of those factors will be kind of genetic, kind of hidden factors, but some of those will be directly related to the subgroup that you're talking about here, or the ethnic group you're talking about there. So, the hope is to have better, more generalizable results. Now, it's important to note, in a clinical trial, you're always going to have inclusion-exclusion criteria. You're always going to have, a restricted set of the population to make a trial, actually functional. But I think, a bit more openness to being, trying to take this into account, and more openness in terms of showing to the regulator and potentially to the public what characteristics the trial has is important. I think I would say that, like, the idea of random sampling and randomization are often, they're often conflated when they shouldn't be. Like, random sampling, this idea you take, like, you have an equal chance of coming from the population trial, is different from the power of randomization, which is about creating a kind of portable, well, hopefully portable, or basically relative effect size. The hope is that, if this drug reduces overall survival increases overall survival by 20%, that will be mostly portable across different populations, taking into account, say, a higher or lower baseline rate of the event of interest, of death. But if you have a more generalizable population, you have the capacity to make that more robust, but also you have potentially the ability to dig further into your data and to find interesting subgroup analyses or subgroup trends that could be useful to know about, like some prior warning on safety signals or efficacy signals that could end up being important. I think it's also important that certain populations, so for example the African American community, due to some very horrible historical events, tends to be more skeptical of the medical establishment, and there also therefore tends to be an underrepresentation of that population in trials. So that's kind of a tangible example, but that's also true for other subpopulations, so other ethnic groups as well. I think the idea here is with clinical trials, there should be an active push by sponsors, by regulators, to include those populations and to get them into trials at a rate proportion to their size within that given jurisdiction. So I think that's another good point to make, another thing to kind of keep in mind as well. In terms of multi-regional clinical trials, I think these are now a standard option. I think a lot of sponsors now default to this. CRO, we've seen certainly in our experience, a great growth in the number of contract research organizations, CROs, who specialize in providing these multinational, these global trials, which are especially important in the context of the improved precision in the last, I think a few years ago now, in terms of the guidance on when a single well-designed trial can be used for approval. So obviously the traditional standard from the FDA at least was that you needed two well-controlled, well-designed trials, but the norm to having one big multinational trial which has enough subpopulations that it kind of is equivalent to doing two independent trials. These kind of MRCTs are becoming more and more prevalent, more and more important, though they bring their own challenges and issues as well. Like, the regulatory background here is pretty settled. As we talked about ICH, it's usually a major milestone here. ICH E20 kind of talks about the kind of agreed kind of setting for multi-regional clinical trials at the ICH level. Obviously, the EMA and the FDA and other regulatory agencies have their own unique spins on that. But there is a certain aspect that maybe certain regulators are getting a little bit uncomfortable with the degree to which these multi-regional clinical trials are leading to a reduction in the representation of their specific population, their national population in these trials. And I'll talk about one recent guidance came out from the OCE, which may indicate some interesting trends there. But I think these trends, like, they have significant overlap, right? Like, more getting for rare diseases, paediatrics, increasing the representation of population, trying to reach more populations, and an MRCT obviously has the entire globe possibly as its potential subject pool, patient pool. So in theory, these should all these could synergize together, but there are areas in which these might come into conflict in terms of fulfilling all of these criteria simultaneously. So what are some of these trends? Well, I think in rare disease and pediatrics, like, innovative design, we kind of already covered that in the first half, so there's kind of nice synergy there. But basically, this interest in using innovative designs, adaptive design, Bayesian methods, and basically trying to maximize the value of each patient, of each study that's occurred in that area, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? So I think borrowing, from real world data, from historical data, from other trials, and doing that, creating external control arms, these are all things which I think will become increasingly prominent in rare disease development. And I think it's really just about building the tools there. Like, we have some close friends of the company who are very involved in this area, and they're really exciting stuff going on in terms of this, as we kind of referenced in the earlier two areas. So this is one area where I think those two trends of adaptive design increasingly being used and Bayesian methods being increasingly used are kind of come together and create some really interesting innovations. And then, similar to platform trials, which has been a hotbed of innovation over the last 4 or 5 years since the COVID-19 pandemic in particular, that become a hotbed for kind of testing things out, finding things out about things like Bayesian borrowing that we would not have known before, which will now feed into not just these designs, but also to potentially all types of clinical trial designs for like more standard populations. I think a major focus of the FDA in particular is also the ability to research and develop and evaluate these biomarkers, which could hopefully make it easier to assess the efficacy of treatments for rare diseases or in the pediatric population. So obviously, like, a gold standard endpoint like overall survival is the gold standard for a reason, because it's obviously very objective and it's obviously much harder to create a bias in it. But obviously, it takes much longer for that to occur, and it's much higher burden. And obviously, when you're talking about rare disease, each death is not only tragic in and of itself, but obviously, it reduces the population of people available to do the trial in the future. So, obviously, a lot of considerations go into there. I think you're seeing a lot of potential of these kind of decentralized tech, decentralized trials, where having so many different things you can measure remotely or continuously might give us access to information that could provide really great biomarkers. There's obviously like genetic biomarkers and stuff that could be very useful in terms of creating the trial more efficiently in terms of response adaptive randomization or enrichment. But in terms of decentralized tech, I think lots of really great stuff happening there. And I think the patient perspective is really important. I was attending an FDA event on rare diseases there, I think it was a couple of months ago now, and it really mostly had the patient perspective. I think the patients need to be central in this area, because they're the ones who have the best insight into the realities of the disease that they have, and kind of it's mostly rare disease, of course, and kind of hopefully give us insights that can help us develop and get the maximum efficiency we can while retaining statistical validity to get these patients the treatments that they so thoroughly deserve as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So, very interesting area. That's mostly, I think it's on the next slide, but the FDA, that they announced that they're creating a new rare disease hub, which will obviously go focus on a whole bunch of other things just beyond clinical trial design or the clinical trial area, but which also include major developments such as the kind of focus on complex innovative designs, biomarker development, endpoint development, and such. So really interesting. In terms of trial diversity, I think there's kind of two areas here. One is kind of the soft, the technological improvements, and one is the kind of more harder, requirement changes. So I think improved trial integration makes a lot of sense, not just for this, it's also very useful in general, but I think in terms of improving the coverage of trials, improving the diversity of trials, it makes a lot of sense. So the decentralized trials, which is where we can use like remote diagnostics and such, the FDA had a guidance for that just come out. very recently, and so this could help trials be easier to kind of come to you, right? So, instead of having to, come to a medical center, every month or every week, basically if you have continuous measurement of your, your medical signals, of your heart rate, etc., on a continuous basis, then that can be used in the trial, and hopefully also provides a more thorough measurement than, simply relying on like a single like blood pressure measurement or a single draw of blood every, X number of weeks. One thing to keep in mind, though, and there is a really good project that's a reference, I have reference here, that talks about some of the barriers, though, like to keep in mind the digital divide. Like, for example, the older population, the geriatric population, they may not have the same comfort or access to like digital tools, like a smartphone or to a computer. And so just be aware that, while this should in theory increase trial diversity, there are certain subgroups where it could actually decrease coverage or make their lives more difficult if this becomes too normalized, if this becomes the only way that you're going to run your trial. I also think there's been moved towards integrating trial conduct directly into clinical practice, so things like pragmatic trials. So and open label trials, and then actually, the physical logistical job of, getting these measurements in standard clinical practice when people go to their doctor and getting the measurements in, and such and so forth. There's been several guidances on this, including very recently the integrating into clinical practice guidance from the FDA. As I mentioned, all of these are in the next slide, but also in the references at the end. And so I think there's the hope is if you can kind of bring the trial to people, or you can bring the trial to when they go to the doctor or when they go to a medical center. All of those should hopefully make it easier to both easier just a practical level, because you don't have to go to, you don't have to travel like 100 miles or whatever to get to the medical center that happens to be running the trial, but also, involve stakeholders like your general practitioner or like your nurse, get involved in the process of the trial. And obviously that's someone who you hopefully as a patient have more trust with, have an existing relationship with, that you can then use to get them comfortable with the idea of being involved in a trial in the first place. So lots of really great options there. Diversity action plans are kind of the other end, the more kind of harder rule. So these are now, there was a legislative push, and the FDA published draft guidance on this relatively recently. And basically, this is a formal requirement for ensuring representative trials, and also for appropriate tracking of the representativeness of your trial. So, ethnic factors, gender factors, etc. And, I think this is still up in the air. The recent political changes in the US mean that this may be de-emphasized, but it's out there, it exists, and I imagine it will be integrated to some extent within standard clinical trial practice for phase 3 in particular in the upcoming year or so. In terms of MC or MRCTs, I think minimum sample size requirements. So, ICH E17 provides very broad principles such as proportional allocation for sample size requirements. It was a little bit before ICH E17, but my understanding is that certain regulators, like the Japanese regulator PMDA, they have formal rules, formal criterion for what they expect the proportion of a MRCT to be from the Japanese population to get approval in Japan. It obviously reflects the fact that obviously Japan would be a relatively small player in clinical trials compared to the US or the EU, but they have a formal requirement. If you're going to use an MRCT data rather than just running a bridging study or a clinical trial in Japan directly, a certain proportion of that trial needs to be from Japan, and they have two criterion. And we actually are working on sample size tools to implement the sample size based on those criterion right now. But could we see the US or EU be more specific in terms of their requirements? So because they have such a high proportion, they generally are operating from a position of strength. So they have generally not been too high in terms of being specific on what the sample size should be. But I think, there's a recent guidance from the OCE, which I'll reference in the next slide, which suggests that there's a little bit of concern there, certainly from the EU and maybe increasingly from the US, the FDA, that the trends of more and more of the patient population of a trial being used for approval in their country, not coming from their country or not being representative, being an issue. And then I think AI ML, there was a big announcement from Sanofi during 2024 about a tool for improving accrual success. So effectively a tool which can help you predict, which centers, which patients are most likely to actually join your study and to stay in your study. AI ML, huge area. I talked about it mostly in the 2023 prediction webinar from last year, or well, it's just over last year now. But this is definitely coming. It's already happening. It's obviously one of those areas that's referenced in the IML discussion paper from the FDA from CEDAR and CBER that came out 2 years ago now. But I just, small note, they are aware of it. It comes up in all these press releases, but obviously there could be some conflict there. Like the patients who are most likely to come into your trial and most likely to stay in your trial may not be the same patients who, are from the most diverse population, or, and such. So there could be a conflict here between trial diversity and MRCT if you're basing that on AI ML for accrual model, and then kind of conflict between, the regulator wanting a certain proportion of people from their nation, and which nations are most likely to help your trial succeed in terms of patient recruitment. Because of course we know patient recruitment is one of those kind of things that comes up in every trial where it's all so often slower than expected, so much more difficult than expected, and there's a huge amount of work being done in like clinical trial units in, say, the UK, and in or in the US, to try and help solve the practical problems of making patients more comfortable joining clinical trials and feeling like they have a stake in clinical trials, and so on and so forth. So I provided here just a brief overview of some of the kind of the major developments in the regulatory space, primarily in these three areas. So for rare diseases, the rare diseases considerations for development of drugs and biologics was the final guidance was published in December 2023. So that's been out for a year now. I think that's had a big influence in terms of that push towards a greater comfort in doing these kind of more innovative approaches in rare diseases. So I think that that's been a major milestone, definitely something we want to build on. As I mentioned, this Rare Disease Innovation Hub, which was announced in summer 2024, there's meetings occurring now, there's feedback. I mentioned the meeting I was at, and if you go to the Rare Disease Innovation Hub, you should be able to find recordings of most of those meetings as well. And there's going to be a lot of sub-programs which are focused on rare diseases, which I imagine are all, which are basically all going to be merged into this innovation hub. So you have the Accelerating Rare Diseases Cures program arc, which included a Leader 3D education program, which I actually thought the videos were quite nice. Lots of little nice explainers there for things why like adaptive design is useful, for example. The Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot was started in 2022. That'll probably be all folded into this Disease Innovation Hub, which a lot of work ongoing there. I think the FDA has spent some time in recent years, I think in 2023, updating its pediatric guidances to reflect the laws that exist there, like the PREA and BPCA. And as I mentioned, Bayesian adaptive referenced significantly in the earlier stages, if you want to know more about that. In terms of trial diversity, conducting central clinical trials with the centralized elements, that was finally finalized in September 2024 with a slightly different name from the draft guidance, but definitely focusing in on the major opportunities, but also the challenges and things you should keep in mind if you want to do a decentralized trial or include decentralized elements like continuous monitoring and such using medical devices. Integrating randomized controlled trials for drug and biologic products into routine clinical practice, a bit of a mouthful there. Draft guidance came out in September 2024. I think once again, these two things are very, very much linked together. This idea that the FDA is becoming much more open to kind of, clinical trials not having to be like as rigid about how they're run, like you have to, recruit the centers and they all have to sign all these things, being a bit more open, pragmatic to kind of, coming to people where they are. I think, as I said, that directly feeds into kind of hopefully increasing the diversity and making it easier to reach more patients and, creating solutions for more patients like rare disease patients and so forth. And, I think there's been some updates to the ICH E6. There's another revision to that, and the WHO guidance for best practice in clinical trials, which were both updated and which both also make some pretty significant references to these more innovative approaches like decentralized trial elements and integrating into routine practice. So very interesting there. ICH E17, as I mentioned, is kind of a landmark approach in MRCT. So this is a much more formalized area than these other two. Like it's much less in flux, but like the PMDA, as I mentioned, had its own. We want a certain proportion of sample size from a global trial to be from Japan if we're going to give you approval in Japan. But the FDA, I don't think this is going to happen because the FDA is obviously still so important and it has a lot of leverage, so it doesn't need to be as explicit perhaps as the PMDA. But in the considerations for generating clinical evidence from oncology, from a multi-regional clinical development program, they just noted a decreasing proportion of US participants. That's just for me, just a flag in the ground that maybe there'll be if you're doing an MRCT, you may need to do a little bit more justification in oncology. But what happens in oncology very often ends up going to the other areas that that you need to keep an eye on, ensuring that the US proportion of your trial is sufficiently large and that the FDA is sufficiently happy with that up front. So just something to keep an eye on, I would say, mostly there. The AI/ML FDA discussion paper came out in 2023. Draft guidance is coming out in 2025. this is very likely a topic I could be talking about this time next year. And the EMA has the Accelerating Clinical Trials in EU program launched in 2022, which is for them trying to regularize these clinical trial regulations across the EU, hopefully make it easier to do cross EU trials, which has been a challenge in the past because each country has its own kind of unique way of unique regulations. And that's part of a wider push in the EU, because the EU historically has been the biggest center of clinical trials, had the most patients for them, and obviously has a strong pharmaceutical industry. But there's been a lot of push in recent years to the loss of market share of EU companies, to the loss of patient population in clinical trials due to the much wider usage of MRCTs, for example, to kind of pulling that back a bit, make sure the EU is still a leader there. And so a big push there in terms of pharmaceutical legislation, in terms of this ACT EU program as well. So in terms of discussion conclusion, I think we're just out of time, so I'm not going to have time to go through questions with you, unfortunately. Clinical trial innovation is continuing at a rapid pace in response to the challenges of conducting clinical trials and ensuring that we have trials that are getting to the right patients in the right time, as fast as we possibly can, while ensuring trial integrity. Like adaptive design usage continues to grow at all stages of clinical trial development, and the ICH E20 should be a major milestone in normalizing adaptive design usage in the development of clinical trials going forward. Bayesian methods are very common in early stage clinical trials, but very interested to see how this Bayesian guidance, draft Bayesian guidance for the FDA in 2025 shakes things up in terms of growing it in phase 3 in particular. And in terms of like the normalization of things like Bayesian borrowing and stuff and other elements being integrated into standard practice. And initiatives to make trials more inclusive and flexible should help provide mechanisms which get better reach into underrepresented populations, into underserved populations, such as the pediatric or rare disease population, and hopefully just make trials more comprehensive. So I think, the more representative our trials are of the actual population, the more representative the conclusions of those trials should also hopefully be. If you're interested in trying nQuery, either you don't have nQuery or you have like the base tier and you want to try the expert tier, you can try that for 14 days, unlimited, like with no credit card, nothing. We just need your email address, and you can try it within your browser at statsolves.com/nQuery-demo. And finally, I just want to thank you all so much for attending today. This is a really exciting time to be involved in clinical trial design, and in a small part here at nQuery. Lots of really interesting things that come out. Like I've become very much a nerd into this type of stuff, and these kind of trends should be really interesting to keep an eye on. So if you're interested in knowing more, you can contact us at info@statsolves.com, or you can go to our website. We have a lot of examples. We have the recordings of all the previous webinars in the webinar series. We have templates, which are kind of short snippets from our webinars, which cover specific areas. We have lots of other additional information like white papers and such. So, very much want to thank you so much. And as I mentioned several times, there are references provided in this slide deck, which provides a lot more additional detail. All of the regulations that I reference are all here alongside some, well-known and well-used books, such as like Jensen Turnbull's group sequential book. And if you want to know more about adaptive design, if you want to know more about platform trials and Bayesian trials, and if you want to know more about confirmatory Bayesian trials, extending trial coverage, etc. So, without further ado, once again, I want to thank you so much for attending today. I hope you get some useful insights here, some things that you too will be excited about learning more about in the upcoming year in terms of the regulatory landscape and in terms of the types of things you might see, your colleagues and stuff discuss in terms of the options for the clinical trials you might be running. But I suppose that's enough for me for now. I want to thank you so much one more time for attending. I hope you have a great 2025, and I'm looking forward to talking to you next time in our webinar series. So thank you so much, and goodbye.